I don't think folk music would be the same without this guy, J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of the beloved and best-selling books The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, as well as loads of other books. He's often credited as inventing the genre of high fantasy. He was also an incredibly talented painter and visual artist. He was an amazing songwriter and author, as we know, so can he also be credited for influencing the UK folk revival? I mean, how many talents does one person get to have? But credit where credit's due, right? So what got me thinking about this? I've recently released my own version of Tolkien's Far Over the Misty Mountains Cold, which was a song from The Hobbit, and it got me thinking. Tolkien's massively influenced me as an artist and a songwriter, and I'm also influenced by a lot of British folk and folk rock artists, so I wondered, is there any crossover? So how much did Tolkien influence folk music in this country? To answer this question, we need to go back in time to one of the first folk revivals. A chap called Francis James Child started collecting folk songs in the late 19th century. He wasn't the only person to do this, but he was one of the most well documented, travelling around the country, speaking to people, collecting songs and publishing them. Later, in the early 20th century, people like Vaughan Williams and Cecil Sharp were doing the same thing. Now, at this same time, J.R.R. Tolkien started writing the Silmarillion. He started crafting Middle-earth, and he was massively influenced by Norse culture and Anglo-Saxon culture, like the stories of Beowulf, and these would have been passed down in an oral tradition, similar to folk music. In 1916, Tolkien fought in the Battle of the Somme, and in the trenches, he was writing ideas for some of his universe of Middle-earth. He became unwell and he was sent back to the UK, but his experiences would change his life forever, and the influence of what he saw during the war can be found throughout his writing. But as well as his war experiences, something else from around that time influenced Tolkien's writings. In a lot of his works, you can find fictional folk songs that he has written for his characters to sing. I don't know if he was directly influenced by Vaughan Williams or Cecil Sharp, but I think it's fair to say folk music would have been part of the fabric of the UK at the time, and Tolkien was clearly interested in folk song culture as he included his own version of it in his books. Let's fast forward to the 1950s. On the 29th of July in 1954, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings was published to moderate success. Meanwhile, the UK music scene, according to some sources, was in a stagnant place. For example, Donovan, who was growing up in the UK in the 50s, said it was stiflingly respectable and ruled by an intellectually bankrupt authority. It was grey, lacking poetry, and spiritually sterile. That's not to say there was no good music coming out of the UK in the 1950s, but there was definitely an urge to find something authentic. On the folk scene, people were becoming interested in what was happening in America. They had their own folk revival, and artists like Woody Guthrie, Leadbelly, and Pete Seeger were becoming popular in the UK, and British people were yearning for their own folk revival to happen. And it was starting to happen. Peggy Seeger came over to the UK from America and started working with Ewan MacColl and Bert Lloyd at bringing folk songs to a bigger audience. They created radio ballads where they brought folk songs and stories of ordinary people to a huge audience. They established some of the first folk clubs, and more started to appear all over the UK. A folk music revolution was coming, just as Tolkien had published Lord of the Rings. Then in the 1960s, folk music booms. Although it might not have been quite as successful as the Beatles, it was certainly mainstream, and folk artists were a household name. Artists like Shirley Collins, the Watersons, Martin Carthy, Anne Briggs, Fairport Convention, Pentangle, Bert Jansch, and the Incredible String Band started recording old folk songs that were reaching a mainstream audience. And although this happened at the end of the decade, I don't think you can mention the folk revival without mentioning Steel I Span. This has got to be one of the best albums ever. Anyway, back to the story. Bob Dylan also came to the UK in the 1960s and even learned folk songs from Martin Carthy. Bob Dylan's Dream is inspired by Lord Franklin, which he learned off Martin Carthy. And Martin Carthy was nominated for a Mercury Prize last year. Well done, Martin. Very well deserved. And what else happens in the 1960s? Lord of the Rings booms as well. Youth culture becomes obsessed with it, not just in the UK, but also globally. people came up with slogans like Frodo lives. They started learning Elvish. And I think the interest in folk music and Lord of the Rings was all part of the same movement. They share themes of natural imagery, the pastoral. For example, the Shire is all of the shires in England, and Tolkien writes folk songs throughout The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien's world of Middle-earth went hand in hand with the aesthetic of the folk revival. And at this point, I think his works begin to very specifically influence the next stage. In the 1970s, one of the biggest bands was this one, Led Zeppelin, and Robert Plant sings about Gollum and Mordor, so that's not exactly a subtle influence from Tolkien. He was literally singing about Middle-earth. This was a mainstream chart-topping band singing folk songs and singing about Lord of the Rings. And can you argue Led Zeppelin was the most mainstream folk band that we've ever had? They were friends with Fairport Convention, so there was an awful lot of crossover there, and lots of Led Zeppelin songs were just American folk songs. In 2001, then, the first Lord of the Rings movie is released, Peter Jackson's The Fellowship of the Ring, and there is another huge wave of Tolkien-obsessed young people. And in the same way that Tolkien's books influenced the fantasy genre, I would argue that the Lord of the Rings movies influenced a new era of fantasy movies and TV shows, all of them packed with their own, you guessed it, folk songs. And this coincided with the YouTube generation. It became common, and still is, for ordinary people to pick up instruments and to learn the folk songs that they were being given in these fantasy movies and TV shows, and even write their own versions. Over a decade ago, I even recorded my own album of songs from The Hobbit, which you can find on my Runcible Spoon YouTube channel, and I'm making this video because I've just recorded another version of Far Over the Misty Mountains Cold, and if you put Far Over the Misty Mountains Cold cover into YouTube, you find a lot of versions. I think this is folk music at its finest. Folk songs are crafted not just by one individual, but they are gradually chiseled together over time by lots of people. And I think the internet has made it possible for lots of people to start working and reworking the same songs. Tolkien influenced a set of events which have led to people collaborating all over the world to create versions of these songs. So I think Tolkien wrote fictional folk songs in his works that have become genuine folk songs. The Vikings used to tell sagas and sing songs about dragons, and so do we. So what's the point I'm trying to make? Just like in the 1960s, people are starting to become interested with that aesthetic of looking back at the past, becoming interested in folk songs and folk culture. So in this video, I'm not trying to suggest that J.R.R. Tolkien single-handedly created and set in motion the events of all the folk revivals. I think there's a lot of similarities in themes and aesthetics happening side by side, and you can see how Tolkien was influenced by the folk revivals and then, in turn, with his success, began to influence it in return. He certainly influenced me, and I hope you'll check out my version of Far Over the Misty Mountains Cold. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. I'd love to know what you think, and in the comments, please link any acts and bands that perhaps I missed off my lists, and any other versions of Far Over the Misty Mountains Cold that you think I should check out. I've done my very best to be as accurate as I can with all my facts. I've also put all my sources down in the description, so feel free to check those out. Thank you so much for watching. Next time I'm going to be exploring a song called The Skylark and the Oak, which is a love song I didn't mean to write and kind of became the soundtrack to my life. But until then, take care of yourselves and see you soon.